we can't expect a world in which policymakers are going to have time to read 80 different studies on a particular subject, all locked away in academic journals.
The key is often to start from the questions that policymakers are already struggling with. Not from the literature gap, not from whatever they can find out there, but really from a decision gap, right?
That shared knowledge base should be a global good that is shared and utilized by everyone, and of course interrogated, contextualized, understanding where biases and gaps are. But it would be a shame if knowledge became something that only existed in the organizations that were able to review 10,000 studies in order to get to their systematic reviews.
Yeah.
Welcome back to African. We live in the age of information overload. We also live in an age where the generation of impact evidence has become a priority. But its consumption by policymakers is somewhat inconsistent. And this is one of the biggest challenges faced by the producers of evidence, i.e., the researchers. Making research relevant to policymakers is of the essence, especially development research. So the key question we will ask today is how researchers can shift to a policy and practice-driven lens, which can address the questions that matter to policymakers. Evidence synthesis is the short answer to that question. With a focus on education, two experts of evidence synthesis will be discussing how it can be tailored to the needs of policymakers. In particular, we will discuss the role of AI in facilitating the synthesis, as well as the risks that it brings to the process. In particular, we'll be discussing how certain sources of evidence from the developing world itself could be less likely to make it into the synthesis. Today, my guests are Samuel Kembu and Jonathan Kay. Samuel Kembu is one of the global leads for learning and evidence at the Jacobs Foundation and is responsible for overseeing in-country activities in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. He plays a pivotal role in steering the foundation toward dynamic learning, supports the foundation's efforts, and co-designs methodologies for measuring impact. He's driven by his passion for data and social science. With over a decade of professional experience, Samuel has worked as an economist in prominent international organizations and served as a full-time lecturer at the University of Lausanne. He is also a co-principal investigator in large-scale randomized experiments assessing educational interventions in West Africa. He has a PhD in economics from the Aix-Marseille School of Economics and an MSc in game theory, applied econometrics, and experimental economics from the University of Lyon. Bienvenue, Samuel.
Merci, that's quite intimidating. For having me. Thank you.
You're welcome. And Jonathan Kay is head of evidence synthesis at the Education Endowment Foundation, or EEF, where he has created a teaching and learning toolkit and guidance reports. He also leads the international partnerships that the EEF supports across 20 countries as part of the Evidence in Education Network. He's been at EEF since 2014 in a number of roles, including leading the policy team and the publication of evaluation reports on EEF-funded randomized controlled trials. He's an honorary fellow at Durham University and a board member of the Campbell Collaboration. So let's kick off the discussion. And my questions will be for both of you. So please feel free to feed off each other. Could you please explain the concept of evidence synthesis and the work that Jacobs Foundation and EEF are doing around it? Maybe you can start, Samuel?
Sure, happy to. And the expert on evidence synthesis is John. I mean, you can look at his title. He's the head of that at EEF. And he will be really diving, I would say, deeper into the question around synthesis specifically for your audience. But I wanted to share that, one of the biggest issues we have in education, and actually in economics and even social science more broadly, is that we often build entire narratives on a single paper. And you will see that, across the board. People will tell you, oh, you have to read this last study that we did in this context, and we found this. And you go to conferences, and people will be talking about that way. But I have to say, and John, please correct me there, that's not how science works. In health, for instance, no one would base any public policy on one trial. Could you imagine? People would usually look at bodies of evidence through systematic reviews and meta-analysis that show what's consistent, what's uncertain, what works in different contexts, and so on and so forth. So in education, that culture of kind of synthesis is still emerging. It is slow, it is expensive, it is fragmented. So if you look at policymakers and even forget about practitioners, they would turn either to outdated reviews. If they do, they would turn to ChatGPT, which will be able to summarize without judging the quality. They would turn to individual studies and so on and so forth. So what we do at the Jacobs is working really to change that by strengthening the infrastructure that allows research to be synthesized and used. And together with partners, great partners such as EF, John is on the call, the What Works Hub for Global Education, the Future Evidence Foundation, UCL, AP Center, and others, we are building what we call the synthesis-ready evidence repository. And it took us some time to get to call it this way because we needed to be very, very specific in what we are doing. But you can think about it as kind of a plumbing of the global evidence ecosystem, a shared open repository where research is already tagged, is coded, and ready for synthesis. And I think this is really, really important. And what that means is that national evidence intermediaries, we probably let's call them EdLab for now, and I'll go back to that concept later, can produce really context-relevant synthesis much faster and at the fraction of the cost, That's what we are testing. And the goal to close is not simply having more evidence, if you think about it, but what we are really pursuing is a better use of evidence. And the nuance is important. So we want to move, as I started, to saying this paper finds this, to the evidence shows this on whatever we are doing, and making synthesis more normal, more accessible, and part of how education systems really make decisions. So John, do you want to share a little bit more on the work of EF there, and maybe helping auditors see what's the difference between different types of synthesis?
Yeah, and I think that your central point there, Samuel, is the most important one, which is a move from basing changes in policy or changes in practice from individual studies where we all see strange outlier studies to trying to build it on an evidence base. So when we talk about evidence synthesis, what we're typically talking about are more systematic reviews. So lots of people might be familiar with a literature review when you maybe find a sample of studies to illustrate a point or provide some context at the beginning of either a discussion paper or an academic paper. But I think what's really important to say here is when we're talking about systematic reviews, we're not talking about finding a sample of the evidence base in order to kind of prove a point or provide a bit of context. What we're really talking about is trying to find all of the evidence in order to provide a balanced view of both the positive and negative studies that have been conducted on a particular policy or a particular practice. So the three aims that we say in a systematic review is we want to be comprehensive. So we want to find everything that's relevant to our research question. We want to be transparent, so it needs to be really clear where the studies have come from, what the process has been for finding the studies, and we want to be replicable. So if another academic team were to come and want to find the same evidence for the same research question, they should hopefully get to the same result, or at least have a really clear understanding as to why we've come to differences in interpretation of the evidence base. And that's really important because even when we move away from the world of single studies to the world of collecting evidence together, in lots of places, it's possible to advance any narrative you like by just choosing a subset of the studies. So maybe there's an approach that is incredibly positive overall, but in any approach, there's a couple of studies that show a null or negative impact. And if I'm a cynical policymaker or a cynical advocate for a particular approach, maybe I'm trying to sell something to policymakers or sell something to schools, then it's very easy for me to just take that subset of the evidence and tell the story I want to tell. And what we're really trying to do with this kind of approach to synthesis is move beyond that. And as Samuel said, I think that the amazing thing that Jakob's really leading here is all of what I just described is incredibly capacity intensive. You know, when we're talking about comprehensively reviewing the evidence base, sometimes I've been part of reviews where in order to have a review with maybe 20 studies, you've had to read 10,000 abstracts to narrow down and find the studies that you want. And the more that we can coordinate, the more we can share that effort and make sure that we're utilizing AI, but also utilizing collaboration, the more we can build a cumulative knowledge base in education that can be shared. So it isn't just owned in, very wealthy North American, I'm speaking from the context of the UK, which I should be really clear about up front, where we're a What Works Centre that's based in the UK that have a very privileged position in terms of having core funding and a lot of capacity to conduct this evidence synthesis. But really, that shared knowledge base should be a global good that is shared and utilized by everyone. And of course, interrogated, contextualized, understanding where biases and gaps are. But it would be a shame if knowledge became something that only existed in the organizations that were able to review 10,000 studies in order to get to their systematic reviews.
Yeah.
Wow. That's really a fantastic introduction to the concept of evidence synthesis and really putting it forward as a new frontier of knowledge, really. So that I think is clear now. Maybe now we can move on to the relationship with the policy world in particular. And so there I'm particularly curious how you embed the evidence generation and use within government and implementation. And it's in particular, I'd like to know from both of you, what are your favorite examples of what you call embedded labs, which have worked particularly well so the public really understands.
John, do you want me to start again? You can breathe a little bit.
Yes. I always want you to start, Sam. I always want time to breathe.
Thank you, John. Okay, well, that's a really, really good question. I have to say that, I've been guilty of that, of putting things that way as well. For me, the real question is not really about how you embed evidence. And I know this might sound controversial, but the real question is really how we make sure, how we ensure that evidence is a normal part of how governments think and act. And I think this is really, really the fundamental question. And I want to even extend it because oftentimes we limit ourselves to policy. But I know most of the work that John and the EF are doing in the UK is very much practice-facing. But what I'm going to share now would also apply to those contexts based on the experience that we have been gathering a little bit there. So, to your question, Francesca, in education, what you're asking means that, once again, we are moving from one-off projects, or external studies to really having and building ongoing collaboration where research, where policy, where practice is infused, informed, by research, and the same is true in the other direction, right? Where we have almost policy-driven research, if I can put it that way, where researchers are basing their own questions on what policymakers care about, and I have very tangible examples that I can share from a recent trip in Ghana. So at the Yakos Foundation, we'll be testing the model called evidence labs, or education evidence labs, or ed labs, and we commissioned a review on think tanks. Maybe you can share the link as well with the audience on policy labs, describing a little bit more for us. And what you see is that it's not necessarily about creating new structure inside the government. It's actually very simple. It's establishing a function, or at least resurrecting, if I may put it that way, because it often exists in certain places, a function that would generate, that would synthesize, that would translate evidence into response, responding to real questions that policymakers have. And the starting point there is, for all of them, we've seen it, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, the starting point is really capacity strengthening for decision makers and really supporting them and bringing them on that journey. So my favorite examples, I would have many, so I don't want to offend our partners because they are really the ones leading the work you're making. It's a difficult position to be in. But in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, we've been partnering with the Ministry of Education and Innovations for Poverty Action to do exactly what I described. So what they do is really to start by, supporting the capacity of the decision maker. And they took quite some time, by the way, to identify where exactly would these functions sit, which they have found. And after that, they will build the capacity of the stakeholders. Innovation for Poverty Action, IPA, did that. And the unit, the function would be doing a couple of things around, producing rapid reviews, commissioning studies, writing evidence briefs. And now we are pushing that frontier with the work that we are doing now around also doing synthesis on questions that are relevant for decision makers. And you can think about them in the broad sense: teacher training, teacher placement, motivation, absenteeism, and so on and so forth, girls' education, and so on and so forth. So that's what we have in Cote d'Ivoire. And in Ghana, we have the Ghana Education Evidence and Data Lab, or GIT Lab, connecting really the ministry, universities, the Ghana Education Service. Is a more distributed ecosystem that we have in Ghana. So the role is really to bring a coalition of actors to, test interventions, build a national culture of evidence use. And again, as we say, with the work that we are doing, push that frontier on synthesis. And I want to, close by saying these are not to be viewed as standalone projects. I think, once again, these are collaborative functions that will really help the system learn in real time. And the goal of all of this is to make evidence generation, evidence use, evidence synthesis part of the DNA of policymaking. In the same way it is already in other sectors. I'm giving ourselves, some time until giving ourselves a couple of years to go back and see how well we've done with that objective. But this is very much the DNA of what we are trying to do. Over to you, John.
Yeah, and I think that thing that you said about building the culture of evidence use is the most important piece there, because I think it's often really easy when we talk about kind of policy implementation, supporting policy making, to get drawn into these very linear processes where, let's find a really well evidenced program and then convince policymakers to scale that program. And, that is obviously really worthwhile in building capacity in a system. But it's rarely responsive to the needs of policymakers in particular. Once in a blue moon, you get a nice situation where there's a policy need that aligns really nicely with a program that's been evaluated. Yeah. But, generally speaking, that won't always happen. And so building that culture, I think, is so important. And I think one of the prerequisites of building that culture is having a knowledge base that is available to everybody, not just researchers, but policymakers, and having a knowledge base that has been synthesized, because we can't expect a world in which policymakers are going to have time to read 80 different studies on a particular subject, all locked away in academic journals. And I think once you have that shared knowledge base that researchers, policymakers can access freely and share and understand, that's when you can think about innovative ways of positioning that evidence to support with policy decision making. So one very UK-centric example that I'm very proud of is there were professional development reforms in the UK where policymakers discussed what should we train teachers in as they enter the profession. But by having a shared knowledge base, they could build that curriculum on the basis of evidence rather than on the basis of what policymakers wanted to be in it. And at EEF, we had a relationship with them where we independently quality assured that evidence base and said, there isn't actually enough evidence for this at the moment, so this should be removed from the teacher training curriculum. And it's a really nice example of how evidence can support changes in practice that are evidence-based and will have a positive outcome. But also that it offers something to the policymakers, because being evidence-led rather than being seen as a political reform means that as changes in government happen, those reforms have a bit more stability. There's a bit more consensus built around them. So I think one of the things that having that shared evidence base can do is put you in a position where you can be a bit more responsive to the needs and the decisions that policymakers are having, rather than being driven by individual, often programmatic evaluations, which are often more conducive to a kind of a linear approach to mobilizing evidence.
That's right. Yeah.
Super. So one of the things I take away from what you were saying is that there is an element of the process which is a sort of vulgarization as well, perhaps, of some of this academic evidence. Is that a challenging aspect of it? And also tell us, what other bigger challenges you see in bridging these worlds of academic research and policy. John, maybe respond to that one first.
Yeah. I won't make you go first every time, Samia. So I think, one of the problems is about accessibility of the evidence space, and sometimes people talk about that as though it will be solved by plain language summaries. Really kind of obvious responses. Well, let's just make all of the academic papers better written, and we'll get better communication skills in our teams of academics. Yeah. But actually, the interesting thing there is that doesn't solve the problem. In fact, it creates a slightly different problem, which is, how do you want policymakers to choose and access evidence? Do you want it to be on who's the best communicator of the evidence? That's also a problem. You don't want the choices to be made on having someone who's a great communicator of one study versus the 30 other studies that don't have those advocates for them. So ideally what you want is a world in which you solve the coordination problem and are able to present the evidence base overall from an objective source rather than one particular advocate. And I think that's one of the things that's really inspiring about the EdLabs approach, is what it's doing is creating these voices that can solve that coordination problem and build systems of evidence use, rather than having individuals that advocate for evidence use. And then the second thing that I think is continues to be a problem is responsiveness. So the best way to kill any relationship with a policymaker on the value of evidence is for them to ask you a question and you to say, well, we're going to design a randomized control trial and get back to you in 2 years' time. It's going to cost hundreds of thousands of pounds to do. And you may get,
you've been generous,
yeah, and you may get a no result at the end. So we can't even promise you'll find anything out. And so I think the need is to be responsive. And I think the nice thing that evidence synthesis can do is take a policymaker's question and think about what the current evidence base says that can practically provide the best answer to that question. And I think that kind of that need to be responsive is so crucial, and maybe even going beyond that, the need to be co-constructing those projects and answering those questions together, I think is clearly the kind of the key barrier to overcome, because having the best communicated but completely irrelevant study is going to do nothing to change policymaking.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more with everything you've said, John. Lack of responsiveness, poor communication, and so on. I have lived a little bit in both worlds. First as an academic, and now working a little bit closely with policymakers. And I think John has said it all. I see two things to add. Maybe one is really around incentives, and the other one around humility. On incentives, I feel researchers and policymakers, in my view, are playing very different games with very different clocks. In academia, your success is really measured by publication in top journals. And it can be more or less difficult depending on the discipline. Meanwhile, in policy, your success is often about solving a problem before the next budget cycle or before the next elections, and so on and so forth. So, even when both sides would genuinely, and as John was saying, it's not about necessarily communication, because oftentimes we think it's because research has not been communicated in the best way, but that creates another problem, as Steve was just outlining. So I think even when both worlds would care about impact, their timelines, their rewards, their incentives would not necessarily align, and would then end up with excellent research that sits unread, uncommunicated, and policies that are just reinventing what's already known. And I mean, to John's point, that's exactly some of the problems that we hope ed labs or evidence labs would be solving. And I think one thing I've noticed, in different contexts, the foundation has been looking at these models in different geographies, by the way, in Africa, in Latin America, in Switzerland, Europe, our home country. And what we notice across the board is that for researchers who really want to work at this intersection, the key is often to start from the questions that policymakers are already struggling with. Not from the literature gap, not from whatever they can find out there, but really from a decision gap, right? So it's moving from literature gap to decision gap. It's a shift as well in the way in which we think about the research. And what practical way, once again, is they engage with ed labs and that type of intermediaries, because they are the ones doing that being at that nexus between research and policy. And the second one is humility. I would say we have to admit that sometimes the most relevant policy questions are not sexy discoveries for researchers, right? Sometimes it's not new. Sometimes it's just about synthesizing. It's about translating what already exists. It's not creating new knowledge. And that creates another, alignment, because people care about creating new knowledge. But now what we are saying is, we want people to support, synthesis-ready evidence and real-time collaboration and implementation research and so on. None of that, most of that is not necessarily really interesting for core researchers, someone starting their career. If you tell them, come and work with me on implementation of the language of instruction policy in Ghana, they will tell you, well, thank you, but that's not an interesting research area for me. There might be some slight question, but depending on the discipline, oftentimes people will not necessarily have interest. So those are some of the challenges: lack of incentive, as John said, lack of responsiveness, poor communication, and also something I call it humility, but you can call it something else.
I think humility is a very good word, actually. I think it's sometimes not that widespread in research. That's sometimes the case. So it's very relevant in my view.
Right.
Brilliant. So maybe now we can move on to talk about, that great trendy topic of AI, and what part it takes in this whole process. So, it's clearly a facilitator of evidence synthesis. But I'm curious whether there are other ways of synthesizing evidence. And in terms of the AI, does the data power that accompanies it, sort of bias the kind of evidence that it synthesizes? Either of you, maybe Sam this time.
No, that's
He's going to throw to me. Sam's going to throw to me on this one. I don't. I've got to be careful because you set me up on intellectual humility with the last question. So I'm going to be very centered on the limitations and the humility we should have towards AI. And I think it's actually an important point here, because the temptation is to say AI is the exciting new thing. Let's just get AI to do the synthesis. There are countless policymakers already that the first thing they do is, well, I'll just tap into ChatGPT. What is the evidence for X? What is the evidence for Y? And the sad thing is we're not there yet. That isn't yet a good summary of the evidence. And obviously there are strengths. It is a very effective tool for communication. It certainly presents that kind of responsiveness that academia is often very bad at in terms of being responsive to the questions of policymakers. But I think, my initial description of synthesis, that desire to be comprehensive, that desire to understand both study quality, impact, the variation behind studies, to be able to think very consciously about things like context and transferability, you don't yet get from generative AI models when they're synthesizing the evidence. So, the current position when we talk about evidence synthesis is largely human-led. So it involves teams of researchers searching databases and grey literature for studies, screening more studies than they need to try and ensure they've got everything included, and then extracting information from those studies and then summarizing them, hopefully in a very well thought out, responsible report that considers all of those kind of nuances with the evidence base, not just presenting an average effect, but also presenting the things that cause variation that sit behind those averages. But of course, that is a very time intensive process. It's also a very boring process if you're a research assistant and need to screen 10,000 studies, clicking through one by one, saying, do I include this? Do I not include this? So I think where we are at the moment with AI is there's been a lot of developments in what we might call AI assisted synthesis. So rather than AI doing the synthesis for us, when it comes to finding those studies, can we use searches we've already run, big data sets, to try and use AI to refine the searches? So maybe rather than 10,000 studies with an AI assisted search, maybe I'm only looking at 2,000 studies. And then when it comes to screening the studies, there are now developments where, as you screen the studies, you can teach either machine learning in traditional machine learning models or AI to see what are the types of studies we're rejecting, what are the types of studies we're including, and then maybe suddenly you're down to screening 200 studies rather than 2,000 studies because the machine is supporting you through that process. And the big questions there are, what are the other places where AI can support us to keep that very rigorous, that very transparent process, but at the same time, speeds the process up. And so there are so many trade-offs there where I wouldn't yet trust a machine to do the full synthesis. But there are bits that are very kind of manualized processes that it can make a great deal quicker. And of course, the other challenge we need to make sure is that we're not embedding biases through using these machines. So there are lots of ways that those biases might occur. Maybe the academic databases they search are primarily European, North America. Maybe they prioritize certain journals. Maybe they miss large amounts of grey literature, policy reports that are often published on government websites rather than in academic journals. And you don't want to base your knowledge base on a biased subset of the evidence. I mean, it's worth saying that those biases also occur with humans, so we shouldn't, we definitely should continue to have that humility that Samuel talked about, and not claim that humans don't introduce those biases, because there are lots of examples where they do. And then the final bias that we've got to be really careful is in the interpretation of the evidence base. So I've seen lots of examples of hallucinations where people have tried to use AI to categorize an evidence base, and it just gets it wrong. Like a lovely example is in health, someone tried to use it to classify the age groups of studies. And there was a massive group that they got wrong. So all of the studies that focused on early onset arthritis, the AI had categorized as studies of old people rather than young people, because it connected the word arthritis with the concept of being old. And so it's introducing this bias into the evidence base that were meaning you were getting answers that were just factually wrong. And then the final thing that's important when we do a synthesis is the kind of statistical analysis that underpins the work. So one of the things that meta-analysis tries to do, which is the quantitative analysis of lots of studies together, is to understand where pooling the evidence gives us more information than the individual studies. So maybe you have 10 studies that all are slightly underpowered. You know, they've taken place with small groups of people. They all have a positive effect, but it's not a very secure positive effect. When you give those 10 studies to AI, what it tells you very confidently is there's no evidence of impact, because it reads 10 separate authors saying there's not enough evidence of impact, and then goes, oh, this confirms there's definitely no evidence of impact.
Right.
But when you quantitatively analyze those studies together, because the results are all in the same direction, you might get a really secure positive impact. And so the risk in relying on asking ChatGPT is actually a real missed opportunity cost of maybe there are interventions that have a really good evidence base that, because we're not synthesizing the results together, because we're taking an AI summary of 10 null impacts, we get a confident answer that this thing doesn't work, and we're missing the chance to do a really kind of positive intervention. So obviously all of this stuff's changing really fast, and there's greater investment in supporting removing these biases, working the AI through a process. But I think I hope in 5 years we'll be in the world of really living synthesis that is largely AI powered, where the humans can focus on the difficult decisions of interpretation, of mobilizing the evidence. I think as it is, we're still very much in the process of either human in the loop or human led but AI assisted synthesis.
Yeah.
Sam?
Well, John said it all.
Sorry, Sam.
I think maybe one very, very quickly. I like to. I was on the UNESCO expert panel yesterday, and there was someone reminding us about the digital divides and the fact that we might be facing yet again a third digital divide. Apparently, two others that Mike Trukanu and others have put forth. I think it's important to all keep in mind that technology just amplifies, to John's point, whatever ecosystem it is operating in. So if the underlying evidence base is narrow, dominating in the way you shared, John, English language, global North, and so on, then the AI will simply reproduce that imbalance even faster. And I think that's really why for us at Jacobsen, as part of this process, we really see AI as an enabler. I think that's really, really important, not as a substitute, for human judgment or for, ability to discover and to include a broader range of evidence. Of course, caring about the quality of it. You can use AI to look at, as you were saying, what are other sources that are out there that I have not been able to look for. And I think even within this process, there's a lot of being able to build small robots that are going to look into all those policy reports that are often sitting and dead on websites that no one is thinking about. I think synthesis, when I think more about it, and building on the time I spent with John last year at the EF. It's not just a technical process. It's really a lot of, if you allow me to say it this way, kind of a value choice. You have to think about what counts as evidence when you're thinking about the question. What gets included in a given study synthesis. Sorry, how do you interpret context? How do you weight it? And all of these are human decisions. I don't think AI would be replacing any of that. So AI can do the heavy lifting. I think that's the main message in my view. But we still need people, especially those in country, by the way, at labs and in evidence intermediaries, to be able to do a couple of things, to be able to interpret, to be able to question, to be able to adapt the evidence to realities that they are facing. But this is absolutely a critical question, Francesca. And again, I have to listen again to the podcast to take note of everything John has said on that.
You're being too humble, Samuel. Brilliant. Well, it's been absolutely fascinating to speak with you both, honestly. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's all we have time for today, but yeah, thank you so much. I think everyone will be very interested in this episode. Thanks a million both.